Hello, my name is Sarah Holland, and I am doing my presentation on Chapter 11, which is Communications Within Organizations. So to start, let's give you an overview. The text really emphasizes the nature and purpose of communications within an organization, the methods used, the process itself, different networks that happen and are formed, and then managing those communications. So to begin, what is communication? The text defines it as the social process in which two or more parties exchange information and share meaning. So essentially, delivering messages, communicating, having conversations, that's communication. So within an organization, there are 5 main purposes to communication. The first is organizational goals. So communicating the mission or the value of the company, or even team goals to accomplish an overall task. That is organizational goals that are communicated. Next is task directives. So if a manager gives an employee a specific task, he or she will then communicate how that task can specifically be accomplished in the steps to make that happen. Next is the results of efforts. So this is your evaluation meetings. How is that employee doing? How can they improve? Or maybe how can they pick up the slack? And maybe some specific questions that you may have as far as their performance. Next is decision making. So how did an organization come to a decision that was made, communicating that to its employees? Or even if a conflict or situation arises, how are they communicating to come to a solution? And lastly is the expression of feelings and emotions. So if an employee is upset with another employee, how is that communicated and solved? Or if an employee doesn't necessarily agree with what an organization is doing, how is that communicated as well? Those are the main aspects seen within an organization. So in regards to that, there are 3 main aspects or methods of communication to deliver those messages. And the first explained is written communication. So this is letters or emails or memos. It could also be reports or financial progress reports. Anything that is written down and not physically explained verbally. That is written communication. Next is oral communication. That's what I'm doing now. I'm speaking, giving a presentation, or having face-to-face conversation, maybe a group discussion, or maybe a team meeting. Anything delivered orally can also add to a meaning through the pitch and tone. So that is another aspect that written communication doesn't necessarily have. And lastly is nonverbal communication. This is facial expressions or posture or body movement. Any of that is seen within nonverbal communication. And again, that adds another aspect of meaning to what is being said. And it's important to understand how maybe as a communicator, how my facial expressions are delivering a message in a way that I either want them to or in a way that could be confusing or misleading. Those nonverbals are good to keep in mind. Above all else, the text mentions that it's important before choosing your method of communication to understand your audience and what they need, how they will best respond and understand the urgency of the message. If it's an emergency, then obviously calling a quick meeting to fully explain or even shooting a quick email is going to be your best bet. And then the cost of transmission, how that communication message is going to be sent. So keeping in mind those methods, it's important to understand the communication process as a whole. If you move on to the next slide, I've given you a diagram of how communication happens, just to understand how in an organization the next aspects of the presentation will make a lot more sense. So first is the source. So if I want to deliver a message, I'm the source. I'm the one who wants to say something or deliver a message. The receiver is the one receiving that message and understanding and interpreting it. Encoding is how I am translating that message into symbols or words, in other words, in a way that the receiver will understand. That's encoding. Transmission is how those words are transmitted or sent to the receiver. The medium is the channel, so whether that's sound waves of me verbally speaking, or writing it out in an email. That's the transmission. Decoding is how the receiver is interpreting that message, how they're understanding, and then feedback is once that message is understood, the receiver will then give feedback to the sender, affirming that the message was understood, or maybe it wasn't understood. And then the process continues to circle. It's a cyclical process, as you can see in the diagram. You may also realize that there is several bubbles that say noise. This is any distraction or anything that can distort a message or make it misleading to the audience. Those are things to keep in mind, whether that's physical noise or whether that's preconceived thoughts or beliefs. That's all going to be categorized under noise. So after understanding the methods in the process, now we can get into organizational communication as a whole. So the text really explains that within an organization, communication can happen in multiple different ways. The first aspect is more formal, and this is formal specific systems of communication. So the first one is small group networks, and this is wheel network, chain network, circle network, and all channel network. The wheel network is essentially there is a manager in the middle, or someone in management, and then team members like spokes in a wheel coming out from the manager, and those spokes only communicate to the manager, not to each other. So the manager is receiving all the information and communicating all the information to those different spokes. Chain network is the chain of command. So for example, I am a resident director at Liberty, and we really emphasize this system. So my resident assistants, if a crisis happens with one of their students, they communicate directly to me, and I communicate directly to my administrative director. And there's a specific chain of command and chain of communication that needs to happen. And it only goes up and down, and it doesn't go side to side. Circle network is really for forces or committees, and that's when people in the group communicate side to side in a circle fashion. They communicate with each other, but they don't communicate to anybody else. And then all channel network is when all members communicate with everybody. That's the most inclusive form of communication. When it comes to organizational communication networks, this can tend to be a little more informal. So yes, there are those small group networks that do happen, but then in a grand scheme of things, sometimes information needs to be processed quickly, and the information needs to be gathered quickly, and so it can't always be in that formal chain of command or wheel network, for example. So there are different aspects of an informal network that are given by the book. One role that is played is the gatekeeper. This is basically a person who allows and controls what information is going to which member of the organization. So whether that is an employee who needs to talk to the CEO, they would go to the gatekeeper first to understand what is acceptable to communicate and what isn't. Another character is the liaison. And this is kind of the connector. They are the bridge between different groups. They communicate, whether that's from financial aid at a university to registrar. The liaison is someone who knows both offices and communicates between them. The cosmopolite, I believe it's pronounced, is someone who communicates with the external aspects of an organization, so people outside, so what is up and coming, maybe potential employees, etc. And then lastly is the isolated dyad, and these are people who just communicate with themselves. They kind of stick to themselves. And lastly is managing communication. So after knowing all these different networks, how then can that be managed? Something that's emphasized is communication fidelity, which is described as the degree of correspondence between the message intended by the source and the message understood by the receiver. So we want every message to be understood, and we want that to be a high priority. So in order to improve the process, there are different aspects that this needs to happen. So first, within the source, one problem that is seen is withholding or filtering information to the receiver. So maybe as the source, I don't think a receiver necessarily needs this aspect of the information, but in reality they do. So making sure that that doesn't happen. Next, in the encoding and decoding process, sometimes there's a lack of knowledge or understanding of the sender. So maybe they're using jargon or semantics, which is maybe different meanings for words that I understand, but the receiver may not understand. So making sure that that doesn't happen as well. In the receiver aspect, sometimes the receiver will have selective attention, so what they want to listen to, value judgments, maybe what agrees with their beliefs, source credibility. If they don't think that the sender has enough credibility, then maybe they won't necessarily receive that message as well. And lastly, overload. If there's too much information, the receiver's not going to be able to retain that. So those are some things that managers need to keep a lookout for and make sure that that does not happen. And then lastly is feedback. Sometimes a receiver doesn't give enough feedback and there's a lack of verification. So then the sender feels that they need to either send the message again or just proceed without verification, and that's where miscommunication occurs. And then lastly is improvement in organizational communication. So how to do that is reducing noise. So within the communication, there's something called a grapevine, and this is an informal system of communication that coexists with a formal system. So the manager needs to know the existence of this and then also needs to monitor the accuracy of the information because it does happen, but it's important to know how it happens in the intricate information being delivered. And next is foster informal communication. So this is encouraging face-to-face communication, encouraging trust is gained here in acceptance. And then lastly is develop a balanced information network. So making sure that information delivered maybe through email or maybe through presentations isn't an overload for the receivers. So making sure that there is a balance there in that it's understandable and it's easy to retain for the receiver. And as far as organizational communication goes, that is a quick overview as much of time we have today. But my question for you is, have you experienced formal, which is those wheel network, chain network, those kind of communication systems, or informal ways, maybe doesn't have a system within an organization? In which aspect, either formal or informal, do you believe is most effective within an organization? I would love to hear your thoughts, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you very much.